Now close your eyes and imagine you're sitting in a small submarine descending far below the Atlantic Ocean. Out the window you see the deep, dark blue water lit up by the spotlights from your submersible. You're going deeper and deeper, further down toward the bottom of the ocean. Your instruments show you're close to your destination, so you turn the cameras on. Suddenly you see something through the darkness of the sea, lit up by the spotlights. It's the wreckage of a ship sunken deep into the sand. This is it. It's the one and only Titanic. It's been here for over 100 years and covered in coral and sea life. You drive around the ship and through and around it and continue to film so others can see the remains of this amazing ship from history. Now let's go back to 1909 when two cruise liner companies, White Star Lines and Cunard, were under intense competition to build the best and largest cruise boats in the world. Cruise boats are designed to move passengers across the ocean and in addition are made for entertainment and luxury. This means the people on them are usually on vacation, want a nice room and plenty of things to do as they sail across the sea. It can make for a very relaxing trip. Some of the well-known cruise liners today are Royal Caribbean and Carnival. Disney also has its own cruise ships. In 1909, White Star Lines wanted to be the best cruise liner, so they decided to build 3 new ships, which would be the biggest ships ever made, called the Titanic, the Olympic, and the Britannic. The name Titanic comes from the Titan of Greek mythology. The Titanic was constructed by the shipbuilders Harland and Wolff in Belfast, Ireland. Altogether, 15,000 people worked on the Titanic. The ship was steam-powered, which means coal was burned to create the steam used to move the 3 gigantic propellers. Huge boilers were constructed to heat up the coal and produce the steam and 46,000 horsepower. It took 3 years to build the Titanic and cost over $7 million. 3 million rivets were used to attach the hull of the ship, made of iron and steel. The finished Titanic was 882 feet long, which comes out to about 3 football fields if you can imagine that. This made it the largest cruise liner built up until that time. Because of the way it was designed, many said that the Titanic was unsinkable. The Titanic was a luxury cruise liner, which means that many of the rooms were very well decorated and comfortable for their occupants. It was made for 833 first-class passengers. This means the very nicest rooms. Then 614 second-class passengers and 1,006 third-class passengers, whose rooms were nice compared to most ships, but not as nice as the first class. A total of 2,453 passengers could fit on the Titanic, and then came the crew, the people who helped take care of the ship and keep it sailing, which came to around 900. The inside of the ship was decorated like a hotel. It had elegant dining rooms, a saltwater swimming pool, a gymnasium, squash court, massage rooms, and hot tubs. Even though the third-class passengers didn't have access to many of these areas, their dining rooms and common area were pretty nice compared to most cruise liners at the time. One of the Titanic's best-known features was the grand staircase, which connected decks E and F. The Titanic's maiden voyage, which means its first voyage, started on April 10, 1912, in Southampton, England. It first stopped in France and then Ireland and continued across the Atlantic Ocean headed for New York in the United States. White Star Line's managing director, J. Bruce Ismay, and one of the ship's designers, Thomas Andrews, were passengers along with many celebrities such as John Jacob Astor IV, a wealthy heir to the owner of Macy's, Isidor Straus and his wife Ida, Benjamin Guggenheim, and the heiress Margaret Molly Brown. Margaret Brown was born in the United States in Missouri, and while she had a difficult life growing up, ended up moving to Colorado, where her and her husband's mining business struck gold. Margaret used her wealth to do good, helping people in need and finding other ways to help the less fortunate. She often traveled around the world doing good, and happened to be in France when she found out her grandson was sick. This caused her to book passage on the Titanic and head back to see him. But unlike Margaret, most of the passengers on the ship were normal people, traveling between Europe and the United States, the third-class passengers who paid less than $20 for their voyage. The first 3 days of the trip were fairly normal. The seas were calm and the skies were clear. On the night of April 14th, one of the crew members was on the lookout. He suddenly saw something through the fog, an iceberg. An iceberg is a huge piece of ice that floats in the water and is common in the North Atlantic. Other boats had reported seeing icebergs, but this one was very large and very unexpected. The crew member rang his bell and called the captain. Immediately the engines were reversed and the gigantic ship tried to turn and miss the iceberg. And from above the water it appeared as though they had missed the iceberg, but below the water it struck the side of the ship and caused a 300-foot tear in its side. When the captain and Thomas Andrews, who helped design the ship, went below decks to look at the damage, they could already see water pouring in through the gash. The ship had started to tilt and water was beginning to fill the different compartments. Andrews did a quick calculation and estimated they only had about an hour and a half before the ship would sink. Quickly everyone started loading into the lifeboats, which had been added to the ship in case of an emergency. Many women and children were allowed to get on the lifeboats first, but unfortunately most lifeboats were put into the ocean too quickly and didn't get enough people on them. It was also unfortunate that the Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats. The people who built it didn't think it would be necessary, and that lifeboats would take up too much room. Many brave people gave up their seats on lifeboats for others. The captain decided to go down with the ship along with its builder, Thomas Andrews. Margaret, or Molly Brown, was one of the celebrities who helped others onto the lifeboats and was finally forced onto one herself. While on the boat, she did everything she could to make sure the others were safe. She desperately wanted to go back and help more people, but the other passengers on her lifeboat wouldn't let her. Once she was rescued, she did everything she could to help the other survivors. As the families on lifeboats rowed away from the ship, the Titanic slowly began to fill with water for 3 hours until it shifted and cracked in half and then dropped below the surface. In the end, 706 people survived the sinking of the Titanic, but more than 1,500 did not. Eventually, a ship nearby heard the radio calls for help and arrived to help the people in the lifeboats, but it was too late for the other passengers aboard the Titanic. Soon the news spread around the world that the Titanic had sunk, but no one could believe it. Truly, the sinking of the Titanic was one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. For many years after the sinking of the Titanic, many people wondered exactly where the wreckage ended up. They knew generally where the ship had gone down, but the water is extremely deep in the North Atlantic, and likely the wreck moved very far below the landing on the ocean floor. Many expeditions set out to use sonar to find the Titanic, but it wasn't until 1985 when a French-American team led by Jean-Louis Michel and Robert Ballard found the wreckage. After this, submersibles with cameras and later with people were sent down to film the wreckage. They sent remote-controlled cameras inside the ship and brought back video of the inside to examine what had happened to the ship and what it looked like now, the many years after it had sunk. Since this time, many books and movies have been made about the sinking of the Titanic. You can also watch documentaries about the history of the Titanic, the people on it, and the many voyages made down to its wreckage. Learning about these people and events remind us that even though we've come very far technologically, people and the things we create are still imperfect. It's important to design things with care and consider the people who are using them. Since the sinking of the Titanic, all boats are required to have life vests for everyone, and large cruise liners are required to have lifeboats for every passenger. When you get a chance, take some time to watch videos about the Titanic. Its history is fascinating. And always remember, educating yourself helps your brain grow, and learning history helps you better understand the past and the world around you. A long time ago, people wanted to build the biggest, fastest, and most luxurious ship ever. This ship was called the Titanic. In the early 1900s, ocean travel was the main way people moved between Europe and America. Ships carried not only wealthy travelers, but also immigrants looking for a new life. Competition among shipping companies was fierce, and each one wanted to have the best and most impressive ship. One of these companies was the White Star Line, which was owned by a businessman named J. Bruce Ismay. He wanted his company to be the leader in ocean travel. Instead of focusing only on speed, like some of his competitors, he had a different idea. He wanted to build the biggest and most luxurious ship in the world.
It would be so large and grand that passengers would feel like they were in a floating palace. It would have elegant dining rooms, a grand staircase, and even a swimming pool, which was rare on ships at the time. To make this idea a reality, Ismay worked with William Peary, the chairman of Harland and Wolff, a famous shipbuilding company in Belfast, Ireland. Together they planned a new class of ships that would be bigger and more advanced than anything ever built. The Titanic was one of 3 ships in this new class, along with the Olympic and Britannic. These ships were designed to be the most comfortable way to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and the Titanic would be the grandest of them all. The goal was to create a ship that would attract wealthy travelers who wanted luxury and comfort, as well as ordinary people who needed a safe and reliable way to travel. The Titanic was not just a ship, it was a symbol of progress, engineering, and the future of ocean travel. Many believed it would be the greatest achievement in shipbuilding history. The construction was one of the most challenging projects of its time. Building such a massive ship required thousands of skilled workers, engineers, and designers. Over 15,000 men worked at Harland and Wolff, the shipbuilding company in Belfast, Ireland, where the Titanic was built. These workers included riveters, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and steel workers, all playing important roles in assembling the ship. They worked long hours in difficult conditions, using heavy tools to shape and fasten the Titanic's steel frame. One of the key figures behind the Titanic's construction was Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer. As a naval architect, he oversaw the entire building process, making sure every part of the ship was constructed properly. Andrews was known for walking through the shipyard daily, inspecting the work and talking to the men building it. He wanted to make sure the Titanic was not only strong, but also beautiful and comfortable for passengers. Workers had to carefully lift and attach heavy steel pieces, using massive cranes and wooden scaffolding to build the ship's structure. The Titanic was built with over 3 million rivets, which acted like giant screws, holding together large steel plates. Riveters, one of the most important jobs in shipbuilding, had to hammer in each rivet by hand, a dangerous and exhausting task. Sparks would fly as red-hot rivets were driven into place, and many workers risked injury while assembling the ship's hull. The Titanic's engines were some of the most powerful ever made at the time. The ship had 2 giant steam engines and an additional steam turbine, which together created over 46,000 horsepower. These engines powered 3 huge propellers that pushed the ship through the water at speeds of up to 24 miles per hour. Hundreds of men called stokers worked deep inside the ship's boiler rooms, shoveling tons of coal every day to keep the engines running. Every detail of the Titanic was carefully planned, from the grand staircase to the elegant dining rooms and comfortable cabins. Skilled craftsmen built wood-paneled walls, chandeliers, and stained glass windows, making the ship feel like a luxury hotel. Even the third-class areas, though simpler, were designed to be more comfortable than most other ships of the time. The Titanic was a masterpiece of engineering and craftsmanship, built by thousands of hardworking people who took great pride in their work. After years of hard work, the Titanic was finally ready to set sail. It left the shipyard in Belfast on April 2, 1912, and was tested in the water before its first official trip. People were amazed by its size and beauty. It was one of the greatest ships ever built, a symbol of human invention and skill. Imagine a quiet, dark world deep beneath the ocean. There is no sunlight here. Strange fish glide silently past. Then something appears out of the darkness, a giant shape resting on the ocean floor. It is covered in rust and sea creatures. But if you look closely, you'll see iron railings, broken windows, and once grand staircases. This is what remains of the RMS Titanic, the famous ship that sank more than 100 years ago. And inside it, scattered and hidden, are treasures from another time. For decades, no one knew exactly where the Titanic had gone down. Some tried to search for it, but the ocean was too deep and the technology wasn't ready. Then in 1985, a team led by oceanographer Robert Ballard finally found the Titanic. Using a small underwater robot with cameras, they discovered the ship nearly 2.5 miles under the sea. The front and back halves of the ship had broken apart and now lay in two pieces. Around the wreck were thousands of objects, lost treasures of the Titanic. These treasures are not just gold or jewels, but everyday things that tell the story of the people on board. There were suitcases, shoes, dishes, letters, jewelry, coins, glasses, and even bottles of perfume. Each item helps us understand what life was like in 1912. Some belonged to rich passengers, others to workers or families traveling in hopes of a better future. These objects stayed at the bottom of the ocean for decades, protected by the deep, cold waters. One of the most touching discoveries was a small leather bag filled with musical instruments. It belonged to Wallace Hartley, the Titanic's band leader. He and his fellow musicians kept playing music as the ship sank to help keep passengers calm. All of them died, but they were remembered as heroes. Finding the bag helped bring their story to life in a powerful way. Another interesting find was a tiny vial of perfume oil. It still had a strong scent, even after being underwater for over 70 years. The perfume had belonged to a traveling salesman who hoped to sell it in America. When researchers opened the vial during a museum exhibit, visitors said the smell brought the past to life in an amazing way. Some of the ship's china dishes were also found, many still in good condition. The plates had the White Star Line's logo, the company that owned the Titanic. There were even unopened bottles of champagne, eyeglasses, and notebooks. Each item was like a frozen moment from the past. Many of the treasures were brought to the surface and cleaned carefully so they wouldn't fall apart. They were placed in special museum displays around the world. These exhibits showed visitors what life was like aboard the Titanic and what people wore, ate, and carried with them. They helped people connect to the real lives behind the famous story. Another important item connected to the Titanic was the Marconi wireless telegraph system. This early form of communication allowed the ship to send messages across long distances using Morse code. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, worked tirelessly the night the Titanic sank, sending out distress signals to nearby ships. Their bravery helped save hundreds of lives. The Marconi room was located on the boat deck, and while much of it was destroyed, parts of the equipment have been found among the wreckage. These remains are powerful symbols of the courage and quick thinking that made a difference that tragic night. One of the most famous parts of the Titanic was the grand staircase. It was a stunning centerpiece of the ship, built to impress first-class passengers. The staircase was made of fine wood, with elegant iron railings and a glass dome above that let sunlight shine down. Passengers in first class used the staircase to move between the ship's luxurious dining rooms, lounges, and smoking rooms. It wasn't just a way to get around, it was a symbol of the Titanic's beauty, wealth, and modern design. Though the grand staircase was destroyed when the ship sank, it remains one of the most remembered and admired parts of the ship's legacy, often recreated in museums and films to show the splendor of the Titanic. Among the many artifacts from the Titanic, the ship's original keys and locks hold a special place in the story. These weren't just any keys, they were used by crew members to access important areas, including storage rooms and cabins. One famous example is the key to the crow's nest locker, which held the binoculars that lookouts might have used to spot danger. Sadly, those binoculars were locked away the night the Titanic struck the iceberg, and the key had been mistakenly taken off the ship by a transferred officer. The keys that have been recovered tell quiet stories of the people who used them, the stewards, officers, and crew who kept the great ship running. These small metal items are powerful reminders of life aboard the Titanic and the people behind its operation. The discovery of the Titanic also led to many questions. Should we bring objects up from the wreck, or leave everything where it is as a kind of underwater grave? Some people believe that the Titanic site should be left alone out of respect for those who died. Others think recovering objects helps teach history and honor the memory of the passengers. Because of these concerns, strict rules were created to protect the Titanic site. Special permits are now needed to visit or recover anything from the wreck. Many new dives use robots or underwater cameras, so the ship is not disturbed. It is a careful balance between discovery and respect. In recent years, new technology has helped scientists study the Titanic more closely. High-quality images and 3D maps show the ship in great detail. Researchers have also found more objects scattered far from the main wreck, like shoes, tools, and furniture. These finds help us learn more about how the ship broke apart and sank. Even after so many years, the Titanic still captures people's imagination. Its story is one of wonder, sadness, bravery, and mystery. Movies, books, and documentaries have kept the tale alive for new generations. The lost treasures remind us that behind the big ship and the big story were real people, mothers, fathers, children, workers, and travelers, each with hopes and dreams. Some families of passengers have been reunited with objects found in the wreck. A child's boot, a wedding ring, or a handkerchief can tell a powerful story. These items connect us across time and help us remember the people who were part of this historic journey. Even today, explorers and scientists continue to study the Titanic. New dives are planned, and researchers hope to learn more about the ship's final moments. The deep sea is cold and dark, but it has helped protect the wreck for over a century. Slowly, the ship is being worn away by salt water and tiny sea creatures, but its story and its treasures continue to live on. In museums, visitors can look at the dishes, clothes, and letters and imagine the people who once used them. In classrooms, students learn about the Titanic and its passengers. In books and movies, the story is retold in many ways. All of this shows how one ship and the things it left behind can still teach us so much. The lost treasures of the Titanic are more than objects. They are memories frozen in time. They remind us of how quickly life can change and how important it is to remember the past. The Titanic may lie deep in the ocean, but its story continues to rise to the surface, inspiring curiosity, wonder, and respect around the world. In 1912, the Titanic set sail on its maiden voyage, and for the wealthiest passengers on board, it was more than just a ship. It was a floating palace. The Titanic's first-class accommodations rivaled the finest hotels in the world, with elegant suites, gourmet dining, and endless entertainment. The people who occupied these luxurious spaces were some of the richest and most famous individuals of their time, traveling across the Atlantic in style. The Titanic's first-class list was filled with powerful businessmen, socialites, aristocrats, and celebrities. Many of them were traveling for business, pleasure, or to start a new chapter in their lives. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the world, was a real estate tycoon and inventor. He was traveling with his new wife, Madeline Astor, who was pregnant with their first child. The couple had been on an extended honeymoon in Europe and were returning to New York. Benjamin Guggenheim, a wealthy businessman from a famous family, made his fortune in mining and smelting. He was accompanied by his valet and his mistress, a French singer named Leontine Aubert. Isidore and Ida Strauss, owners of Macy's department store, were an elderly couple deeply devoted to each other. They had been vacationing in Europe and were heading home to New York. Dorothy Gibson, a well-known actress and model, was returning to America after filming a movie in France. Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, a Scottish nobleman and sportsman, traveled with his wife Lucille Duff Gordon, a famous fashion designer known for dressing royalty and high society women. For first-class passengers, life on the Titanic was designed to be as comfortable and elegant as possible. Many of them stayed in large private suites, which featured separate bedrooms, sitting rooms, private bathrooms, and even personal servants. Some suites had fireplaces, gilded furniture, and large windows overlooking the ocean. The most expensive accommodations, such as the Millionaire Suite, cost the equivalent of over $100,000 in today's money. Every morning, first-class passengers were served breakfast in bed if they wished. They could then take a leisurely stroll along the promenade deck, enjoying the crisp ocean air and chatting with fellow travelers. Many brought along their pets, personal maids, and valets who took care of their every need. The Titanic's grand staircase was one of the most famous spots on the ship, where well-dressed ladies and gentlemen would descend in their finest clothes before dinner. The staircase, with its carved wood, iron railings, and a massive glass dome, was a gathering place for first-class society, where they greeted one another before heading to dinner or an evening event. Dining on the Titanic was an event in itself. The first-class dining saloon was the largest room on the ship, decorated with white and gold walls, sparkling chandeliers, and fine china. Passengers were served multi-course meals prepared by some of the best chefs in the world. A typical dinner might include oysters, roast duck, filet mignon, and decadent desserts like Waldorf pudding. The ship's wine cellar was stocked with the finest French wines and champagnes, which were served throughout the evening. Passengers had the option of dining in the Café Parisien, a charming restaurant with ivy-covered walls that made it feel like a fashionable café in Paris. During meals, passengers were entertained by a small orchestra, which played classical music while they dined. Waiters in crisp uniforms attended to every request, ensuring that the service was as flawless as the food. The Titanic was designed to keep first-class passengers entertained throughout their journey. During the day, gentlemen could play billiards, smoke cigars in the reading room, or have a drink in the bar. Wealthy businessmen like John Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim often gathered in the first-class lounge, discussing stock markets, real estate, and politics. Ladies could spend their afternoons in the reading and writing room, a beautifully decorated space where they could write letters, read newspapers, or have tea with friends. Some women enjoyed shopping at the Titanic's onboard store, which sold perfumes, jewelry, and luxury goods. For those who wanted to stay active, the Titanic had a gymnasium, which featured rowing machines, a mechanical horse, and even an early version of a treadmill. Some passengers enjoyed taking a dip in the heated swimming pool, one of the first ever installed on a ship. Others preferred a relaxing visit to the Turkish bath, where they could experience a steam bath followed by a cool plunge pool. In the evenings, first-class passengers dressed in their finest clothes for formal dinners and social events. Men wore tuxedos, and women wore elegant gowns decorated with lace, beads, and jewels. After dinner, some passengers attended concerts performed by the ship's orchestra, while others gathered for card games and lively conversation in the lounge. For those who preferred a quieter evening, the first-class library was a peaceful retreat, filled with leather-bound books and comfortable chairs. Many passengers took the time to write letters home, telling their families about the incredible luxury they were experiencing on board. Others spent their nights strolling along the decks, breathing in the salty sea air while the lights of the ship shimmered against the dark ocean. The Titanic's first-class passengers were surrounded by elegance and comfort, making their journey a truly unforgettable experience. For most passengers on the Titanic, life was not about fancy dining rooms, huge bedrooms, or relaxing in private clubs. First-class passengers had a world of luxury, but second- and third-class travelers had a much simpler experience. Even though their rooms and meals were not as grand, the Titanic still felt like an amazing ship to them. Many had never been on such a large and modern boat before, and they were excited for their journey. Second-class passengers had small but comfortable cabins. Most rooms had 2 or 4 beds and were much nicer than second-class rooms on other ships at the time. Each cabin had soft beds, clean sheets, and running water. They also had their own dining room with white tablecloths and friendly waiters. There was even a library where they could read books and a deck where they could walk outside and enjoy the fresh ocean air. People in second class were often teachers, business people, or families who could afford a little more comfort, but not the high prices of first class. Third-class passengers had the simplest rooms. Most slept in cabins with 4 to 6 people, and some families had to share their space with strangers. The rooms had bunk beds, and passengers shared bathrooms at the end of the hall. Even though third class was not as fancy, it was still better than what many of them were used to. Other ships often made third-class travelers sleep in large, crowded spaces with no privacy, But the Titanic gave them real rooms, fresh meals, and even a small dining hall where they could sit at tables instead of eating on their beds. For many, the Titanic felt like a taste of the better life they hoped to have in America. Second-class passengers were mostly middle-class professionals, such as teachers, clergy, and merchants. They traveled in comfort, but without the extravagance of first class. Their tickets cost around £13, about $1,700 today, giving them access to private cabins, a library, and their own dining saloon. One well-known second-class passenger was Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher from England. He later wrote about his experience surviving the disaster, recalling the simple but well-kept accommodations and the excitement passengers felt about being on the ship. Third-class passengers, also called steerage, made up about 700 of the 2,200 people on board. Most were immigrants hoping for a new life in America, coming from countries like Ireland, Sweden, Finland, and Italy. Tickets cost around £7, about $900 today, and for many it was their entire life savings. Families traveled together, often crammed into small cabins that held up to 6 people with only a thin curtain for privacy. The food was simple, but better than what most third-class travelers had eaten before. Unlike other ships, where steerage passengers were treated poorly, the Titanic offered clean accommodations, fresh meals, and running water, a rare luxury for lower-class travelers. Some of the people in third class had incredible stories. Rhoda Abbott, an English mother, was traveling with her 2 teenage sons to start a new life in America. When the ship struck the iceberg, she and her boys tried to escape, but she was the only one who survived. Olaus Abelseth, a Norwegian farmer, had left his home to start fresh in North Dakota. He survived the sinking and built a new life in America, but many of his fellow third-class passengers did not. Daniel Buckley, a young Irishman, was one of the lucky ones. As the ship was going down, a woman gave him a shawl to disguise himself as a female passenger, allowing him to board a lifeboat. Others in third class were entire families hoping for new opportunities. Anna Sophia Turja, a young Finnish woman, was just 18 years old when she boarded the Titanic. She had left Finland to work as a maid in America, a common dream for many young European women at the time. When the ship began to sink, she was pushed onto a lifeboat by a stranger and survived. Eugene and Mary Fortune, an Irish couple, were traveling with their children to start fresh in Canada. Eugene and 2 of their sons did not survive, leaving Mary and her young daughters to begin their new life alone. When the Titanic hit the iceberg, survival chances were not equal across classes. In first class, about 62% of passengers survived, while in second class, only 41% made it. The worst fate was for third-class passengers. Only 25% survived. Many were trapped below decks when water started flooding the lower levels. Locked gates and confusing hallways made it even harder for them to escape. By the time they reached the decks, most lifeboats were already gone. For second and third class passengers, the Titanic was supposed to be the beginning of a better life. Instead, for many, it became a tragic end. Those who survived carried their stories with them for the rest of their lives, remembering both the dreams they had and the loved ones they lost. On the night of April 14th, 1912, the Titanic hit an iceberg and began sinking in the cold Atlantic Ocean. More than 2,200 people were on board, and many were left floating in lifeboats in the freezing water. But help was on the way. A ship called the Carpathia heard the Titanic's distress call and rushed to save the survivors. The Carpathia was a smaller passenger ship owned by the Cunard Line. It was not as big or fancy as the Titanic, but it was strong and reliable. The Carpathia was on its way from New York to Europe, carrying around 700 passengers. It was led by Captain Arthur Rostron, a skilled and respected sailor. On the night of the disaster, most of the crew and passengers were asleep when a radio operator suddenly received a desperate message from the Titanic. The Titanic's call for help came at 12:25 a.m. The message was sent using Morse code, a way to communicate using dots and dashes. The Titanic's operator, Jack Phillips, sent out the letters CQD and SOS, which meant the ship was in serious trouble. Harold Cottam, the Carpathia's radio operator, had just finished his shift and was getting ready for bed when he heard the signal. He quickly ran to tell Captain Rostron, who jumped into action. As soon as Captain Rostron learned about the Titanic, he ordered his crew to change course and head straight for the sinking ship. He also told his engineers to make the ship go as fast as possible. The Carpathia could usually travel at about 14 miles per hour, but with extra effort it sped up to 17 miles per hour. The crew worked quickly, preparing blankets, warm drinks, and space for survivors. Doctors got ready to help anyone who was hurt. Passengers were woken up and asked to give up their cabins for the survivors. It took over 3 hours for the Carpathia to reach the Titanic's location. By the time it arrived at 4 a.m., the Titanic had already sunk. All that was left were lifeboats filled with cold, frightened people. The crew of the Carpathia worked hard to pull survivors out of the boats and onto the ship. Some people were too weak to climb, so sailors carefully lifted them up. Survivors were given blankets, warm food, and medical care. Many were in shock and could barely speak. Others cried for their loved ones who were lost in the disaster. One crew member, Seaman James Bissett, later said that survivors looked cold and half dead when they were brought on board. Another crew member, Steward John Hart, remembered seeing women crying for their missing husbands and children shivering from the freezing air. The Carpathia's crew did everything they could to help. By 8:30 a.m., all 705 survivors had been rescued. Captain Rostron gave the order to turn back toward New York, where the survivors would be safe. The passengers of the Carpathia helped in any way they could, giving away coats and comforting those who had lost family members. The ship sailed carefully through the ice-covered waters, making sure to avoid the same danger that had sunk the Titanic. When the Carpathia reached New York on April 18th, a huge crowd was waiting at the dock. Families and reporters stood in the rain, hoping to see the survivors. Some cheered when they saw their loved ones. Others cried when they learned that family members had not made it. The world was shocked by the Titanic's sinking, but they were grateful for the bravery of the Carpathia's crew. Captain Rostron and his team were praised as heroes. He later received medals and awards for his quick thinking and courage. The Carpathia had saved every survivor who had made it into a lifeboat, giving them a second chance at life. Even though the Titanic story is tragic, the Carpathia's rescue shows the power of kindness, bravery, and never giving up on helping others. April 14, 1912, when the Titanic struck an iceberg, the ship was called unsinkable, but within a few hours it slipped beneath the waves. Out of more than 2,200 passengers and crew, only about 700 survived. Their stories help us understand what it was like to live through that tragic night. One of the most famous survivors was a young woman named Molly Brown. She was known later as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Molly had been traveling on the Titanic after a trip to Europe. When the ship struck the iceberg, she helped others onto lifeboats and encouraged people not to give up hope. After she was placed in lifeboat number 6, she insisted the sailors row back to look for more survivors. She became a symbol of bravery and kindness during a terrible time. Another survivor was Colonel Archibald Gracie, who was one of the last to escape the ship. He described the chaos as the Titanic tilted and the sea rushed in. Gracie clung to an overturned lifeboat, freezing and exhausted, until he was rescued by another boat. Later, he wrote a detailed account of the disaster, which gave historians a clearer picture of what happened during those last moments. There were also children who survived the Titanic. 2 little French boys, only 2 and 4 years old, were placed in a lifeboat by their father. Sadly, he did not survive. The boys didn't speak English, and when they were rescued, no one knew who they were. Newspapers called them the Titanic Orphans. Weeks later, their mother in France saw their photographs in the paper and came to America to bring them home. Their story showed both the sadness of loss and the joy of reunion. Many crew members also lived to tell their stories. One of them was Charles Lightoller, the second officer of the Titanic. He was responsible for loading lifeboats and made sure women and children were put on first. When the ship sank, Lightoller was pulled under by the waves but managed to grab onto an overturned lifeboat. He survived the freezing night and went on to serve bravely in World War I. His leadership saved many lives during the sinking. Another brave crew member was stewardess Violet Jessup. She had an extraordinary story because she not only survived the Titanic, but also 2 other shipwrecks in her lifetime. On the Titanic, Violet helped passengers into lifeboats and eventually boarded one herself. Later, she continued to work on ships and became known as Miss Unsinkable. Her courage and calmness made her a legend of the sea. Some survivors' stories were quieter but just as meaningful. Ava Hart was only 7 years old when she boarded the Titanic with her parents. Her mother was uneasy from the beginning, believing the ship was too big to be safe. On the night of the sinking, Eva and her mother were placed in a lifeboat, but her father stayed behind. Eva grew up to share her memories of that night, making sure the world never forgot what happened. For the survivors, life after the Titanic was not easy. Many of them carried the memory of that night with them forever. Some felt guilty that they lived, while so many others did not. Others used their experiences to help make travel safer in the future. Their voices helped lead to new rules requiring enough lifeboats for everyone, lifeboat drills, and 24-hour radio watches on ships. These changes saved countless lives in the years after. The stories of Titanic survivors remind us that history is not just about numbers, it is about people. Each person on that ship had dreams, fears, and families. Some were rich, traveling in first class. Others were poor immigrants, hoping to start a new life in America. When disaster struck, the ocean did not care who they were. What mattered was courage, kindness, and the will to survive. Today, more than 100 years later, the voices of Titanic survivors still echo. They tell us about bravery in the face of fear, about loss and hope, and about the importance of remembering the past. By listening to their stories, we honor not only those who survived, but also the many who did not.